Hello, everyone, and happy Father's Day to you. We have some verses to cover. Maybe you'll watch this today on Sunday. Maybe you'll watch it later. But to get from where we left off, which was the end of Luke chapter 15 with the parable of the gracious father, or the parable of the loving father, or the parable of the lost son, or the parable of the prodigal son, or whatever you want to call it. We are now in chapter 16. And we're going to do the first 18 verses in this video. And there is some sort of tricky stuff in here, so we're going to need to talk about exactly what it means, but I don't think it's going to require a lot of explanation. So Jesus has been talking about the joy of people coming to him, and we seem to have a sort of change of scene, I guess is a way to say that, in chapter 16 without that sounding like fiction. A change of venue, maybe is another way to say it, or a change of moment. Not sure if there's time that passes between chapter 15 and 16 or not, but it does tell us at the beginning of chapter 16, he also said to his disciples. So he's redirecting what he's saying from the religious leaders that he was addressing in chapter 15 now to his disciples. So it is going to be about discipleship. What he says in chapter 16. So here we go. He's got a parable to tell, which can be a little bit confusing, but we'll talk about it and should be able to clear most of it up. All right. Verse 1, he also said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward.' Then the steward said within himself, 'What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I am ashamed to beg.'" I just could pause because I think that's funny. I can't work with my hands. I'm too proud to beg. All right, verse 4. "I've resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, that they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of the master's debtors to him and said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light.'" Now, one of the reasons that this is difficult, I think, is obvious. It appears that Jesus is commending this steward for his unethical business practices. Because make no mistake about it, this was unethical. He was a steward. He was a bad one. He realized he had messed up, and his reaction was, "I need to start thinking about what's next. I need to start thinking about the next phase here, because I'm not going to work with my hands, and I'm not going to beg, and so I need to be taken care of, and so I'm going to go back to these debtors and change their numbers and get them to pay those numbers. Presumably, get them to pay those numbers so that they'll take care of me after I'm out of here," which is obviously is unethical. It's not a good business practice. Yet Jesus says the master commends him because it was a smart move. He tipped his hat to the tactics of the steward, which is a little problematic if Jesus is saying that the steward was right in what he did, which I do not think, and pretty much any biblical scholar you ask will tell you Jesus is not condoning that behavior. What Jesus is pointing out is that he was shrewd because he thought forward to what was coming. Okay? He had his mindset on something else, and so he made smart moves to prepare for what was next. Now you take that concept rather than his unethical business practice, you take that concept and Jesus says, listen, he's smarter with resources than most sons of light are, okay? Thinking about the future. And so the concept here, we're going to see him sort of flesh this out here in a moment. But the concept here is that as believers, we should be using the wealth, the opportunities, the influence, all of that we have for the future kingdom rather than this kingdom. So let's see what Jesus says as we go forward in verse 9. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon. Mammon is wealth, okay? Make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you've not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. So what Jesus is saying, if I can sum this up, is we need to be shrewd in how we use wealth and resources that we have, but we need to use those to serve God rather than using those to serve ourselves, to fill our own wealth and what's happening here. We need to have our eyes ahead on the kingdom that is coming and make sure that we're wise in what we do and we're thinking forward to when that day comes. That's the overarching idea here. Verse 14, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all these things, and they derided him, or criticized him, or mocked him, or jeered him. Okay, they derided him, and he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men. Okay, so they want their reward and recognition and wealth and all that in front of people. But God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. And it doesn't mean that the law had ceased, but the law in the teaching and the preaching of the kingdom was being fulfilled. Okay. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is pressing into it. And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. I know that last verse seems like it comes way out of left field. What does that have to do with what he had just said? And there's a lot of debate over that because it does feel like it comes out of left field. I happen to think that it is just Jesus giving an example of what he's saying, which is you love money and you love power and you love recognition, but I'm telling you that you need to respond to the kingdom of God, which is here, which is the fulfillment of the law. So the law hasn't passed away. We're fulfilling the law. And so it still stands, just like the commandment, whoever divorces his wife, and he gives this marriage and divorce command. The part of the reason I believe that is because there was a debate within the Pharisees, pretty well-known debate between one camp of the Pharisees that was very, very liberal on the law, particularly on this issue of marriage and remarriage and divorce, and one that was more conservative. And the more liberal side of things was, in essence, bending on that commandment to increase popularity and to gain for themselves more followers and wealth and all of that. And so this is an example where Jesus is saying, no, you don't bend on the law in order to get followers and wealth and power for yourself. All right. But as you commit to the law, you need to understand that should lead you to me. And leading them, being led to Jesus, ultimately is, if they commit to that, they are disciples of him. That will lead to future reward, not reward now. So that whole thing is a little bit confusing, but the point is pretty clear as you pull it out and say Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, be wise and shrewd in thinking about the future. Okay, use your wealth for God, not for yourself. And then the Pharisees who have a problem with this, he said, no, you need to get your head and your heart right about this. You need to respond to me. All right, so there it is. Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 18. This weekend, this coming weekend at church, we'll pick up with verse 19, which is the rich man and Lazarus. I hope to see you then.